So the 20th century gave us flashes of light and deluges of darkness. At the dawn of the century came the First World War, the war to end all wars. In that great war, technology, normally a tool for man's development, became a tool for his destruction. Across Europe, a generation of soldiers died. Those who survived were, to borrow Yeats's line, changed utterly. Tolkien was one such changed man. The First World War profoundly affected his personal life and his writings, as it was during that war, during World War I, that Tolkien first saw the carnage men could inflict on each other. He served in the Battle of the Somme, which lasted from July 1st, as you all know, the 100th anniversary was just a couple days ago, through November 18th, 1916. To that end, we'll begin by briefly, I promise briefly, looking at the history of World War I prior to the Somme, move from there to a survey of the battle itself, and then look at how the battle affected Tolkien's life and just a little bit about his works, because I only have 20 minutes. This is a monumental topic, and we really can't justify it in this short time, but we gotta try. It's a story worth telling. And if you want more on this, John Garth wrote a fantastic book about it. You should read it, put it that way. So let's start with the war. On June 28th, 1914, Franz Ferdinand, the Archduke heir to the throne of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and his wife Sophie were shot in Sarajevo and Bosnia. Their deaths triggered a domino effect that, thanks to the elaborate treaties and alliances in place among European nations, led to an outbreak of a world war. Germany sided with Austria-Hungary against Serbia and its allies, which included France and Britain. Somehow the Ottoman Empire gets wrapped into all of this, and by the end of 1914, almost every single major European power is somehow involved in this conflict. And both sides, both the Allies and the Central Powers, seemed confident that the war would be over in a few weeks. Kaiser Wilhelm II, the leader of Germany, famously told his soldiers as they were marching off to war that they would be home before the leaves had fallen from the trees. He was almost comically wrong. Peace would not return for another 4 grueling years. The strategies of earlier war proved fallible in the wake of new technological weapons. The century-old strategy of sending lines of soldiers at opponents did not work well against the rapid fire of machine guns and heavy artillery. It's not surprising then that an attacking force, whether from the Allies or the Central Powers, faced overwhelmingly greater losses than the defenders. Historian Warren H. Carroll states, this is a block quote here, "The machine gun ruled any fixed battlefield. There was no answer to it, no defense against it. Even a few days' stabilization on the battlefront, enough to permit machine guns to be in place in a system of trenches, made that front for all intents and purposes impregnable." Soldiers of both sides literally dug into the battlefield, and trenches traversed the European landscape. Mud and blood mixed, creating a horrific environment. The overwhelming strategy of both sides was to pummel the opponents into submission. Victory meant forcing the other side to surrender through what's called attrition, which is basically you slowly wear down your opponent until there's basically no one on the other side left to fight. One historian notes that the armies became instruments through which the belligerents could bleed one another dry of resources and men. Victory was a few miles, just a couple miles per battle, gained by the loss of millions of lives. The Western Front in particular, situated along the barren border of France and Germany, provided the scene of an inhuman nightmare. The casualty lists of the battle staggered the imagination. An eighth of all British soldiers who went to war in World War I never returned home. An eighth. In 1915, over 5 million men lost their lives. That's not casualties, that's deaths, as flesh and blood charged against the lead of machine guns. By mid-1916, both sides of the conflict feared a stalemate, and the push to gain land on both fronts became an obsession. At the Battle of Verdun, which lasted from February to December of 1916, over 262,000 men were either killed or reported missing. Perhaps the most tragic of all, at the end of the Battle of Verdun, both sides were exactly where they had started the battle. Nobody had gained any land in 10 months. Verdun forced General Sir Douglas Haig, the British general, and his French allies to reassess plans to attack German forces along the Somme River. The new plan was to divert German attention from their attack on Verdun to the Somme, and so both sides began to gather there along the river, and the result was, as we all know, one of the bloodiest battles in human history, especially the bloodiest battle of the war. So let's talk about that battle a little bit. From the start, the Somme was a military nightmare. Haig had called for a week's worth of bombing to destroy the German defenses, but the artillery shells either exploded above the ground, or when they hit the ground, they didn't hit the German trenches, so they just kind of churned up the ground before the German side. The original attack was planned at dawn. It was moved till 7:30, 3 hours later almost, which meant that the Germans now had more light to see the British coming. But that didn't matter because the Germans knew that the attack was coming, because they had intercepted radio communications from British battalions telling exactly where they were going to attack. So they set up more barbed wire, more machine gun nests. The British had no idea that that was happening, so they had no additional defenses, and they expected the paths to be clear, but they weren't. The result was July 1st, 1916, the worst day of fighting in British military history. Tolkien's biographer Humphrey Carpenter describes the battle, the charge, as like this. They scrambled up the ladders from the trenches and into the open, forming up in straight lines as they had been instructed, and beginning their slow tramp forward, slow because each man was carrying at least 65 pounds of equipment. They had been told that the German defenses were already virtually destroyed and the barbed wire cut by the Allied barrage, but they could see that the wire was not cut. And as they approached it, the machine guns opened fire on them. The Allies became disorganized, bunched together rather than spreading out, and in essence became easy targets. One German soldier described it like this. He said, "We didn't have to aim, we just fired into them." The great push soon fizzled out, and the Battle of the Somme became another battle of attrition. As the battle raged onward, the likelihood of survival dwindled. Historian Peter Hart, who wrote a very, I didn't get a chance to read this huge book on the Battle of Somme, wrote this: "Every time the men went forward into the front line, they knew that there was a fair chance that they might never return. Whether they were holding the line or about to attack, they knew that their lives had reached a distinct crossroads. They hoped to survive unscathed, but they naturally feared death, the type of wound that would leave them crippled for life." The no man's land between the two sides became more chaotic the longer the battle lasted. One writer describes it saying that the horror increased daily. The rain, the shellings, and the feet of thousands of men turned the land into a sea of blood. Most traces of vegetation disappeared, and the trees that managed to remain standing looked like survivors of a forest fire. All leaves and bark stripped off or blown away. And there were corpses everywhere, bloated, stinking, disfigured, or mutilated, their parts completely blown away. To put it simply, it was hell. As the long months dragged on, the deadening stalemate begged for a creative solution, and Haig found one in the Mark I tank. The Mark I tank did not have the finesse of later tanks like those used during World War II, and it had two purposes, right? Force a path through the barbed wire and terrify the Germans. It did this by crawling across the ground at about 4 miles an hour, blasting holes through any obstacles it met. It was mediocre at blasting through the obstacles. They did manage to crush through the barbed wire, but in the process would get stuck. Sometimes they would get trapped in the trench holes themselves or the muddy ground. And they were temporarily successful at terrifying the Germans. On their first day of fighting, so September 15th, the tanks led the British to gain about 3,500 yards, okay, before they all broke down in the middle of the battlefield. One British soldier described it like this. He said that once the tanks started shooting at the Germans, rather than their own side, because the tanks had gotten turned around and were attacking the British side accidentally, the J.R.Rs, the Germans, were out of their wits and started to scuttle like frightened rabbits. Despite these small mishaps of tanks breaking down, Haig was impressed, but the Germans got used to the tanks and they soon lost their efficacy. Eventually, in mid-November, the Germans withdrew from the Somme. At the same time, the British and the French officially called off the attack. That's the fancy way of saying that they wanted to surrender too, or give up too, but the Germans did first. And it was considered a victory for the Allies because the Germans left first. And as a victory, it justified not only the entire battle, but also all the other battles of attrition throughout 1916. The casualty numbers still stagger the mind. So these are casualties. 1.4 million men on both sides. Casualties, deaths, prisoners, wounded. Warren Carroll again notes that 600,000 British and French soldiers were killed or wounded just to gain 8 miles. And 650,000 Germans were killed or wounded to limit them to that. Those 8 miles cost the life or health of 30 men for every foot, 2.5 men for every inch. End quote. Now this is a battle, more than any other part of the war, that shaped the young J.R.R. Tolkien. So let's look a little bit about that. So the years that spanned the First World War transformed the young Tolkien. As the war was brewing, his childhood sweetheart and future wife Edith entered the Catholic Church so that she and the Catholic John Ronald could be betrothed. Tolkien was a student at Oxford at the time, and his fellow students, as they were joining the British military, Tolkien decided to remain at Oxford to finish his degree, but it wasn't because he wasn't patriotic. He remained there because it was kind of like a job security kind of thing. He figured that if he entered the army after completing his degree, he could find employment after the war in whatever field he wanted to, and provide for his expected family. It also worked because it was kind of like an officer training camp, so he ended up becoming an officer when he joined. A few years prior to the war and attending Oxford, Tolkien had formed a close group of friends at King Edward's School, and they named themselves the TCPS, the Tea Club and Barrovian Society, after their habit of meeting for tea and conversation in the school's library and the Barrow store in town. The 4 friends, Tolkien, Rob Gilson, G.B. Smith, and Christopher Wiseman, soon gathered around themselves other students at school. However, those 4 friends became the core of the TCPS. They were for Tolkien a sort of predecessor to the Inhumans. If you think of that, then you can think of Smith and Wiseman as kind of a predecessor to his relationship with C.S. Lewis. Christopher Wiseman in particular encouraged Tolkien in the later years of World War I to continue working on his mythology. After they graduated from King Edward's, the TCPS path divided. Tolkien and Smith went to Oxford, Gilson and Wiseman went to Cambridge. However, they frequently exchanged letters and even met occasionally. One of the most famous ones is the legendary Council of London, which, if you know anything about the history of TCPS, was fundamentally important because it was at that meeting that the focus of the group was refined. No longer was it just a group of high school aged boys meeting and hanging out and drinking tea and talking, but they found a focus, that basically their focus was to transform the world for God, truth, and like the great things of the world and that kind of stuff. And it's also at the Council of London that Tolkien found in his friends the encouragement to start his own poetry writing. So you can kind of thank the Council of London for basically all that Tolkien ever wrote. When Britain declared war, the TCPSites answered the call to arms. Tolkien joined with the Lancashire Fusiliers, 1st 13th Battalion, and then the 11th, as a second lieutenant soon after his graduation from Oxford in July 1915, and his marriage to Edith on March 22, 1960. That year, 1916, was one of the most tumultuous in Tolkien's life, because it was during that year that he would experience what he would later call the animal horror of war. Tolkien arrived in France on June 5, 1916. Since he preferred, as Carpenter put it, to, quote, the prospect of dealing with words and messages and codes, rather than the drudgery and responsibility of commanding a platoon, Tolkien trained to be a signal officer for his battalion. His knowledge of codes used by the army allowed him to develop his own code, so sneaky little man he was, to send messages of his locations to Edith, because they weren't allowed to send where they were located. So he developed a special code so his wife could tell where he was in France. And she had a big map across the wall in their house, and she would have like little pinpoints located where he was. Fortunately, they weren't friends of any German spies or anything like that. That could have been really, really bad. Tolkien and his battalion were not yet at the Somme on July 1st. However, Tolkien still faced the effects of that battle right away. In that initial charge on July 1st, Tolkien's friend Rob Gilson died. Tolkien heard about it from Smith and Wiseman. Smith and Wiseman took the news of Gilson's death far better than Tolkien did. Not that they did not mourn for Gilson, of course they did, they lost one of their own, but rather they saw hope in the darkness. Tolkien saw Gilson's death as the end of the TCPS, but Smith and Wiseman disagreed. Smith described Gilson as gone from us, yet still altogether with us. And Wiseman likewise said, and this is a quote, "It is by no means nonsense, though we have no reason to suppose that Rob is still part of the TCPS. But I believe there is something in what the church calls the communion of saints." End quote. It took the friendship of Wiseman and Smith to remind Tolkien that friendship does not end in this life, that it lives on in eternity. It would not be the last time that TCPS suffered loss during the war. Later in the Battle of Somme, Smith died from an infected shrapnel wound. Tolkien took his loss worse than he did Rob Gilson's. They were closer after all. They did go to Oxford together. John Garth writes, "It was for G.B. Smith that Tolkien mourned most deeply. The two had understood each other's social background and maternal upbringing. They had shared a school, a university, a regiment, and a bloody page in history. They had been akin to their reverence for poetry and the imagination and had spurred on each other into creative flight. In short, they were basically an anam cara, what the ancient Irish would call a soul friend. And the death of Smith gave Tolkien, in Bradley Bruiser's words, quote, an even greater duty to carry on their jointly conceived project, which was to do God's will in the world." End quote. July 14th saw Tolkien and the 11th Lancashire Fusiliers' first day of fighting at the Somme. They took part in retrieving the town of Beauvais. As a single officer, Tolkien remained towards the rear of the action, but that doesn't mean he wasn't important. On the contrary, as Garth writes, in this war of men and machines, the infantry counted little, the artillery counted more, and the word most of all. Without fast, accurate communication, no one could hope to have the upper hand. And after a day's fighting, the Allies took the city, or the town, thanks in large part to Tolkien. Tolkien's battalion would be involved in several other attacks before the Somme ended in November. However, he was in no mood to celebrate because on October 27th, barely a week after the final attack, Tolkien got trench fever, bacterial infection, which in the good news would usually just cause headache, pain, but on more severe cases could lead to heart failure or death. Needless to say, they didn't want Tolkien on the front line if he could suddenly drop dead from pain, and plus he was in no shape to continue fighting. So, being sick actually saved his life, because that got him away from the front, got him in hospital care, and as a result he started working on the Book of Lost Tales, which led to the Silmarillion. So let's briefly look at the mythology. Tolkien was always emphatic that war, like World War I, World War II, were not the direct cause of his mythology. And there's something to that. Obviously, his faith, his Catholic faith, his love of medieval literature, all those things were important. However, as Joseph Pierce, biographer, notes, Tolkien's experience of the animal horror darkened his vision to such an extent that the shadow of the World War always lingers vulture-like over his work. And there are several examples that usually pop up that people talk about. The relationship Tolkien had with the Batmen of the army, the regular common soldiers, inspired Samwise's relationship with Frodo. That's a common one. The description of the dead marshes in Mordor are very similar to the descriptions of what you would see of the land around the battlefronts in the Somme. He even describes the dead marshes as, or I can't remember if it's the dead marshes or Mordor. He describes one of them as no man's land, which was the term used for the land between the two sides. But very briefly, I'm going to end with this because I'm almost out of time. But I'm going to briefly look at one very specific example of the effect of the Somme on Tolkien's writing, and that is a short story that he wrote that's in the Book of Lost Tales called The Fall of Gondolin. And there's one thing I want to look at with that, and that's because The Fall of Gondolin, it's a really elaborate tale. It's a story of the gnomes, which are the elves, get attacked by Melko, who's Melkor in the earlier versions, or Morgoth, if you want to call him that. And they take the city, and the elves go into exile, and all this kind of terrible stuff. What I want to look at, though, very briefly, is the dragons used in that battle, because the dragons bear a very strong similarity to the tanks of World War I. And so, first thing, very quickly, Tolkien knew a thing or two about dragons, right? Kind of a given. Particularly, he knew a lot about what he called like the two really true dragons, right? The Beowulf dragon and Fafnir, the dragon from the various Norse sagas. And medieval dragons have very particular things. They breathe fire, they have hard shells, soft underbellies. You can stab them in the belly and they die, kind of thing like that. But then when you look at the dragons at the Fall of Gondolin, they're different. Because the dragons at the Fall of Gondolin are completely metal. They're more machine than monster. And they glide across the ground on the way that the story describes it, like slow rivers of metal. Okay? And they have orcs carried inside of them, like tanks. And their job is to crush down the walls of the city, like the tanks would for the embankments and the trenches. But there the similarity ends, even though they're very similar, because remember that the tanks were used by the English during World War I, and the dragon tanks are used by evil in the Fall of Gondolin. So you got to be careful when you're doing Tolkien drew, because it's not always a one-on-one comparison. Tolkien survived the horrors of World War I with a mission to bring truth to the world as his friends in the TCPS had vowed to do. While the Great War and the Battle of Somme do provide a key to all of Tolkien's work, it does allow us to glimpse into the mythology's genesis. Despite the darkness of war and the horrific battle begun a century ago, this past century produced one of the greatest stories in our Western canon. Good can come from evil, whether through the hand of God or by the imagination of sub-creators like Tolkien. Perhaps that is the ultimate lesson we can draw from the horrors of World War I, the Somme, and the courage of Tolkien. That's it.
Thank you very much. You've got about 3 minutes of questions.
With the machines and the dragons as machine, I'd say it's not just about kind of converting the British tanks and making it's simply because Tolkien had a very ambivalent relationship with technology and machinery full stop.
Yeah, there's the aspect of he really did not like a lot of these like machines taking over. Like, can you imagine what he would have thought of like iPhones and things like that, right? It would not be imagine Tolkien texting, right? Something like that. No, there's definitely something about the idea of like when we put too much trust in machines, we become less human. There's definitely something along those lines, and that's kind of what he's trying to get at. Like, there's an honor in actually fighting, like the actual war. Like the gnomes fight and they use their swords, they have their great honors and things like that. And there's great bravery, but the evil side just kind of they send in these things that are made in factories. I mean, because even the orcs and the Balrogs are made. I mean, they're formed by Melkor. They're not naturally occurring things. They're like they're his own little subcreation. His subcreations are twisted. So that's kind of a thing. But yeah, I think this idea of what we make versus like this idea of like the arms race kind of thing. Obviously, he's not trying to make a metaphor for like World War I or World War II in that sense, but just this grander evil that we face.
Do you think therefore that because he has this bigger view of evil in general, it kind of allows him to see the war, rather than other writers have seen it as kind of a climactic and an end of civilization, to see it as just another war that has greater evils in terms of mechanisation, but simply as another war rather than the end war to end war.
No, definitely. See, that's part of the thing, like when people ignore, like, say, Tolkien's Christianity or Catholicism, there's a very strong understanding in Catholic thought of history that, there's an end to history. And it's not just one thing happening over, like, okay, this is this battle, it's all kind of connected in this grander scheme. And Tolkien in particular was very influenced by G.K. Chesterton. Chesterton wrote The Everlasting Man, which if you haven't read is a great book. You might need to read it slowly over a long time, but it's a great book. In it, he uses this great central thing where we have the incarnation of Christ in the center, and everything leading up to the incarnation is a certain way, and everything out from it is kind of afterwards. So what Tolkien kind of used, because obviously Middle Earth and that stuff is before Christianity, but he still has this understanding of like that there's this good, this evil, this fight that goes beyond our limited scope of things, that there's a wider view. My wife Sarah's going to get into this more, but like the idea that even the evil of Melkor, even the evil things he does with the music of Luvatar, spoiler alert, sorry, Luvatar brings good out of the evil. And so that's kind of this understanding that Tolkien views everything in his life, not just World War I.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.